between hearing, auditory processing, and cognitive factors, and speech perception in adults with hearing loss. So this gives you a brief idea what extensive work and interest Professor Mridula has in auditory processing using cortical evoked potentials. So without taking much time, let's start listening from Professor Mridula. Over to you.
Thank you. That was very kind of you and very kind words. So I appreciate that. And thank you for Isha Khan to invite me to share some of my work that we have done and reach to the point where we are. I've tried to keep my talk on what I think is relevant clinically and some of the lessons that we've learned. But of course, cortical responses are still in a space that is more research than it is clinical. And I don't fully understand why it is so, but I think I can kind of venture some guesses as to why that may be. And I guess last 10, 15 minutes, it would be nice to actually get some feedback from people who have tried to actually get rolling and on using cortical responses more clinically. So what I'm going to do is I am going to talk through some of the background, what got us interested in this, some concepts on speech perception, mismatch negativity, ACC, as we've used it as a measure of discrimination, and then cortical responses and ACC in looking at hearing device efficacy and taking it to that next step. And last, which is, I'm not speaking too much about this last point, but I think it requires thinking about what are the massive gaps in what we are doing at the moment and what we could be doing. So let's start with the background. To begin with, and I've used this before, but it makes a very good point. So I'm going to use it again. And hopefully your volumes are not too loud. And hopefully the noise would share. So simple thing, here's a sound. And you can guess what that is. It's a wobble tone. Anybody who does anything, in free field with kids, that's a sound. You play, normal hearing people or people with mild losses, they should be able to hear it. Now that's a simple percept. Useful, but really, if you want to apply it in real life, is that of any use? Well, what do you do with it? It's on its own, it's just a percept. But now listen to this sound. Now this could be somebody tapping, knocking on the door, or somebody, playing drums, whatever. Now, suddenly it's not just a percept, it's something meaningful. And this is even more so. This is a branch falling, and hopefully you hear it and you run away from it. You don't want that branch falling on your head, right? Life-saving skill. The point I'm trying to make is that there is a difference between a percept of a sound, which is barely acknowledging, I heard that, but it's not meaningful to us unless there is something associated with it, that you can react to it. And that's where the whole idea of percept versus listening comes in. And this was really important for us, because when we started looking at electrophysiology, we really needed to make a decision. What is it that we want to learn from our cortical responses? I mean, why are we using it? And we wanted to apply it so that we could make sense of what a person is hearing and how do they make sense of it, what do they do with it, etc. So this is the reason we decided to actually move away from tones and try some speech evoked corticals. I mean, this is the history of it, right? The other thing that it's worth also acknowledging and noting is that when we talk about speech a perception or speech recognition or speech understanding, there's actually a pyramid, right? It's a scaffolded protocol. You start with the percept of the sound, which is the hearing. You go on to listening, which is with intent. That means you're contributing with your attention. There's comprehension, which is understanding what you heard. And then there's communication, which is a bi-directional or to and fro of information. And for all of those people who are using speech audiometry, which of these steps would you agree that we are actually tapping? Are we really looking at communication when we do speech audiometry in our clinics? Are we looking at comprehension, or is it just recognition of and repetition? So sort of identification of sounds that you're hearing. Or you might use the SRT function, which is basically just trying to figure out which is how well aligned your speech scores are to your PTA thresholds. We are not touching the listening, comprehension, and communication in our clinical practice. And the unfortunate part is that even in research, we kind of taking very small baby steps to get to that point. So I'm telling you the story already, the limitations that exist to this point, to this day. The other thing, of course, is also to acknowledge that it's not completely useless to be able to say that a person heard something or they heard it with intent, it meant something for them, because that's the step that then contributes to your ability to understand, communicate, etc. The limitation is that we don't go beyond that. We barely do percept of sound, and cortical responses, that's what they are. You heard a sound, the cortical response is there. But then to the point where, did you understand that? Can you respond to that, which requires comprehension and communication steps? We're not there yet. If you look at the paradigm of how we break this information down from if you hear speech and what the auditory pathway does, right? So brain peripheral is all about percept, although it all depends. Do you call cochlea peripheral, or is it a start of your central pathway? Anyway, that's a conversation for another day. But nevertheless, we do start to process or define the sound that we hear, right? Tonotopicity begins at cochlea. But cortex is the most fascinating part, because what cortical processing involves is it takes the auditory processing aspect of the signal that you have perceived, it encodes it, and then it also takes into cognitive and linguistic processing to make sense of that complete signal that you have heard. And that's fascinating, right? Why we so to us, cortical level has always been the most interesting. And the other thing, I think what Stapels and Kurtzberg had said way back in 1991, that they acknowledge ABR is definitely more consistent. The variability is less so when it comes to ABR. And they at the time were talking about click. But in general, ABR is standard. It's stable. But cortical, despite it being variable, is also consistent, and you can get it it's reliable, and there are studies that have done to show that, and I'll share some with you today. You can elicit it reliably near the threshold. It corresponds to the loudness of your percept of the signal, right? We've done that study as well. But most importantly, it offers a unique possibility of evaluating higher cortical auditory processing of stimuli with complex acoustic features, which are essential for the normal acquisition of speech and language. So that's why cortical responses make so much sense. But again, unfortunate thing is that despite its abilities and capabilities and how we can actually apply cortical responses, we're still so limited in what we are doing clinically. If you think about or you summarize what's been done so far, the hearing audiology literature and behavior assessments, sure, what do? We do word and or sentence repetition. Maybe at times you might see the Helen test, which is being used as a simple measure of speech understanding, but that's really short sentences like, what comes after Wednesday? What is bigger, elephant or a pen? And what we noticed was even if you didn't hear the whole sentence, you heard what is bigger, a pen, and you didn't hear elephant, you could almost 50% of the chance, 50% of the time you would get it right? Because it's just two things. So there's a lot of, I guess, element of chance in that test. But at least it's better than just repeating words or syllables. But and if you think electrophysiology is anybody, no, it's not. Even there, audiology literature seems to still stay with the syllables, the CVs or CVCVs or simple words. You see a lot of usage of sentences in the psychology literature, not so much in audiology, although it's changing, which is good. But the current focus really what needs to be, and it's starting to be there in the literature and research, is about speech understanding. As I said, you see a lot of usage of Helen's test. We are starting to look at sentence perception, but more importantly, we are starting to record EEG to conversational speech. It's nowhere near clinical stage, but it is still fascinating and it's exciting that we are there. And I'll tell you why that is important too. All right, so let's now look at some of the literature that's there, where we've used speech. We've tried to understand speech perception using cortical responses. Now, this is the work that was done way back now, it's about 2 decades, I realized today. And we are still talking about it because it's still being done. This was when we were trying to figure out cortical responses was being established, although it was not the first time. Way back in 80s and 70s, it had been tried. But looking at comparing speech token to tonal stimuli, because there was still a preference to use tonal stimuli. And this is basically showing this graph here is showing a response from infants. It's an average of, I think there are 20 infants in there. And what strikes you when you look at this response, this P1 response, this big blob, positive blob, you see is that the top, how robust the stimuli, the response to stimuli is as compared to, say, 2 kHz, which is the pink one, or 500 Hertz. So in general, we found that speech tokens, they were complex, and they gave us a more robust response, which was reassuring. It made us appreciate that actually, if they are giving us bigger responses, why are we not then using these speech stimuli? So we went on to use it, and as most of you know, we saw the Hear Lab use those stimuli. Right? So this is showing basically from babies n equals 20, the P1 amplitude, because when it comes to babies 2, 3, 4 months old babies, the most robust response is the positive P1 at around, depending on the stimuli, but around 200 milliseconds. And you can see that actually the bigger amplitudes were to speech stimuli, especially G and T. And if you look at the latencies, then once again, Ma had the longest latency, but that G and T were one of the shorter ones, even when you compare it to the tonal stimuli. So that was, And they were stable, they were consistently present. And we know this because we recorded them from CZ, C3, C4, 3 places, and we looked at all the 3 electrode montages to look for consistency. And it was reassuring to see that. So there's a whole lot of work that's being done. I'm not going to go too further into this, but this was the starting point, right? The other stimuli that gets used a lot in literature, and for the life of me, I can't figure out why we use it, but I've done it too. It's this stimulus, duh. We recorded it. We didn't use the Nina Krause's for 40 milliseconds. What we did was we used our own stimuli that was recorded from a female Australian, born and brought up in Australia, and this is what it sounds like.
Da, da, da.
So the duration is about 158, and one of the things we would talk about, and I'll refer to it, is the duration. Because it's 158 milliseconds, the duh is only at the plosive nature of that. It's only very beginning. So the most of the response is actually coming from the vowel following that, which is the ah. And that's what you can see over here as well in your in the waveform, and you can see that in the spectrum. Okay, but the duration was essential at the time because when we got the listeners to hear it, they perceived that as da. And we used the stimuli then to look at CV in noise. And we went on to say, oh, we're looking at speech and noise, but we all know speech is not syllables. Speech is more than that. But we did do that. This is published work. And what I wanted to show you here was not only that we did use da, we used it in to understand the influence of noise. We looked at it in white noise, but then we went on to do it in babble as well. But this is basically in children, school-age children at 3 dB SNR with background noise. And we also basically tested it twice within 7 to 10 days period, mostly because we wanted to know about its replicability, the reliability of the signal. And that's what we found, that it is reliable. And look at this, the 2 visits, they are they're overlapping. Now, it doesn't show the standard deviation, but we found them to be quite consistent. What was not consistent, or what showed more variability, was when there was background noise. And you can see that here, the N250 between the 2 sessions was definitely significantly smaller the second time around. And that was fascinating because we were wondering what that was. At the time, we called it the N250, but I am going to talk about late discriminative potential, LDN, and that's also a measure of discrimination. And we wondered if this was a representation of a passive learning, that you're repeatedly hearing the same sound, and maybe this is representative of that. Again, going back to this, reminding you of what we are doing. So far, what I've talked about is mostly hearing. The moment we started looking at listening in noise, we are talking about, listening component of it. But even now, we were not looking at comprehension or communication. But what was exciting was the fact that we had tried that with young children, school-age children. We decided to try that more recently in babies, and this was recently published as well. And what we did was we used these 2 sounds, and this time we took shorter stimuli because we didn't really want the influence of the vowel there. And you will hear this. I hope you can hear it, and it's not just me hearing it. Can somebody just show me a thumbs up that you can hear it? Anybody?
We can hear it.
Okay, good. Thank you. So then this one is the next sound is the t. So you would agree that when I played the da with its vowel, it was definitely more speech-like compared to these two, which are really, it's basically just the burst, isn't it? But at least what the response we are getting is to the consonant rather than the subsequent vowel. And this is we are showing. I'm showing you the waveform as well and the spectrum. And when we use the white noise, and this is what we got. We compared the adults to infants. And we looked at different signal to noise ratios because we really wanted to know, well, when we change the signal to noise ratio, what does that do? No surprise when you look at the white noise, which is very low frequency dominant. So ma was definitely more impacted compared to the t sound. But in general, because we had used the white noise, and these are basically at, again, CZ, C3, C4, it's the different colors are showing different signal to noise ratio. The black one happens to be the quiet one, and the 10 dBSNR is the green one. You can see for T, it's quite robust because, again, we used white noise. Silly idea in retrospect. We should have really used the babble. But anyway, you live and learn, right? But you also can see how M got more impacted. Again, no surprise there. Spectrally, that white noise with its low frequency emphasis is going to mask the M sound more than it did ta, and cortical responses showed us that. The importance of the study, for all its fault, was that, again, cortical responses reflect your percept, and that's important. We cannot emphasize and consider that because ABR is nowhere near that, right? The other good thing about this particular paper, and this is Susan Small's paper along with me, the good thing about this paper was, for the first time, we weren't looking only at the group level. We were actually starting to look at individual responses. So here to the M and T at all the electrode places, which is your CZ, C3, C4, at the different signal to noise ratios, the N shows the number of participants, and P is P and N250, which are the positive peak and the subsequent negativity. It shows the number of responses. No surprise, the poorer the signal to noise ratio, the more likely that cortical response is going to be impacted, and which is what you can see, that as the signal to noise ratio got worse, the number of responses that we saw across infants were lower. But what I want to emphasize is at the quiet level, out of 10, every time we had 9, both for T and for M, we actually got 100, but close to 100% of the kids showed us this response. And this is important because more and more I hear questions being raised. Do children who are babies, infants who have normal hearing, how many of them do not show a cortical response? Well, here's the data. In quiet, at least, you see it's 90% is your best response. For T, it's 100% in quiet. Now, the other thing we wanted to also look at is auditory discrimination. Now, why should that be? And why is that important? Now, we could leave it again at that hearing level, the percept level, which was even in noise, listening to noise. We never really asked or checked if the infants were actually listening, right? It could be just passively that you're getting the response, right? You don't need to be actively engaged. And with babies, they were awake, but were they listening? I don't know. But so the question is, why are we making so much an effort with this cortical responses? And this slide basically it emphasizes the importance of the cortical responses. We need to know the baby's auditory discrimination because it is linked to their subsequent language outcomes. 1985, Maltese and Maltese paper looked at auditory discrimination, and they looked at auditory evoked potentials, and they found that their responses correlated to their later language, which was at 3 years of age. A more recent study in 2005, Cole et al., also reported auditory discrimination at 7 months correlated with the language outcomes at 14, 18, 24, and 30 months. So actually, it's so important that we start to not just look at cortical responses, that they hear it. We want to now go to that next level. And here's a question for all those people. Hopefully there are some academics as well. Tell me, do we look at infants' ability to discriminate, even if we look at their BOAs or VROAs? Even there, all we are doing is check their percept of the sound. That's it. We try and get a PTA done, but that's not useful. We need to do that next thing, which is the auditory discrimination. And the easiest ways to do is use cortical responses. So we tried that. The first thing we did was we looked at mismatch negativity. And this is a very old, my paper. I mean, there are more papers that have done this, but just for IP sake, I thought, okay, let me just show my data. So this was looking at auditory discrimination in children, school-age children with reading disorders. And we wanted to know, is there an element of auditory processing? And can I say, having done a lot of work in this field, I still don't know the true answer. One result that we did get, looking at mismatch negativity. Now, if you don't know what mismatch negativity is, basically it is a cortical response. So if I give a sound, ba, 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 every time you hear the ba sound and I record your cortical response, I will get a P1, N1, P2. But the moment I say ba, 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 ga, because ga has changed, your auditory system, auditory cortex, and the memory centers, the frontal centers are immediately going to say, uh-oh, that's different. And because they recognize it's different, you get this extra negativity. And therefore, the word mismatch. There's a mismatch between what I was hearing and suddenly what changed. Okay. And the idea was that if you're good at discrimination, right, you would be you would have good phonological processing, and therefore you would have a mismatch negativity. Well, bearing that in mind, we decided to check this out. And what I'm showing here, the first column A is basically the response to the sound da that was repeatedly presented, and then when it was da as a change. So the thin line shows that mismatch. And the difference between the two, if you subtract these two waveforms, you get this waveform which shows the mismatch. So CG is control group. There were 21 school-age children, a very robust mismatch negativity. And can I point out, this is again at group level. CR happens to be compensated readers. Now, we don't really talk too much about these compensated readers, but during my PhD, as you do, you will listen, I would be doing, and parents would be telling me stories, and I discovered that there are a cohort of children who start off being really late in their reading acquisition, but somewhere along the line, something clicks and they become reasonable readers. It's not that they love reading, but they can read. And and literature, Pennington was the first one who had highlighted the presence of this population, and they call them compensated readers. And that's what we found. What we found, this 15 children who had started off being in remedial reading classes, and then 10, 11 years old. So they were older children compared to my control group and my reading disorder group. And they seemed to be able to read fluently, but reading was not what they enjoyed. And you can see the mismatch negativity where my cursor, hopefully you can see my cursor. It's much smaller than the control group at the top. I'm looking at the column B, by the way. And then when we looked at children who had actively still had a reading disorder, we found no mismatch negativity. And that was very convincing to us that, okay, there is evidence of poor discrimination, auditory discrimination to speech stimuli, but this was again at group level, not individual level. Which brings me to the next, and this is more recent. This is a paper we published last year. This was my collaboration with British Columbia, Susan Small again. And we looked at basically another measure of discrimination called acoustic change complex. Acoustic change complex is basically you're hearing, if I say sh, the change from sh to sh, that change, it's continuous, there's no gap. That change elicits a change complex, as the name says. And that's what we decided to look at. So it wasn't that I present two different sounds. If you yield a gap in between sir and sh, that would also elicit a change complex. So we did this study mostly to look at the reliability. Now, if I test X number of infants, adults, children, toddlers in this case, how many of them are going to show me a consistent ACC? Because until I know that, I can't really look at this in my clinical population. So this study is referring to that. What we did was we used what's called an iterated ripple noise. Basically, you have this white noise, and my student calls it layered noise. What you do is you take the white noise, shh, and in that white noise, you add another white noise, which is slightly delayed. And when I say slightly, something like 10 milliseconds or 8 milliseconds, that's often being used. And you keep adding this delayed. And the more number of iterations you add, the clearer you get a pitch percept. You basically, noise itself has no phase, but because you're causing this delay, you are creating a repetitive phase, and you get this percept of tone, which is quite clear. The more number of additions or these layered noises you have, the clearer the pitch is. And this here, I've got these stimuli spectrograms. You can see the white noise. You know how grainy it is? Now, this is just 4 iterations, so it's not very clear. But look at the second column. Can you see how that the graininess is becoming more lined? The bottom one is with 32 iterations, much clearer. So we presented this to infants, toddlers, adults, and we wanted to see, well, would we get a change complex? So what this is showing here in the adults is the first is the onset, because you have the start of the noise, very nice P1, N1, P2. And this change, the next where I've got even the box there, that is the change from that white noise to the tonal percept. You get that, and you actually elicit a change. There's no gap. We also actually measured an offset response when that tone also switched on. When we looked at our toddlers, right, this is 24-month-olds, you can see that there is an onset response, but more importantly, we actually saw an ACC to that awful pitch as well. 83% of them elicited it. What about babies? 50% of them showed. So we did find that the ACC was not as clearly present in every single infant. So less than, we took, I think, 15 months. We didn't, and not every infant showed us an ACC, but I wondered how much of that was because of the stimuli rather than the age. So this is something, if anybody is interested in looking at acoustic change complex, it would be really cool to do just a reliability study, really. Okay. But it was reassuring that when you look at infants, so 15 months and older, up to 24 months, you can actually get 83% of them showed us ACC. Now, going back again to mismatch negativity, I showed you the reliability, the group effect in my clinical. So now, retrospectively, in more recent, and this is a study that's gone, it's brand new, it's going now, it's under review now. We looked at individual data on that mismatch negativity, and this is from 85 children with listening concerns. And we wanted to look at the mismatch negativity. We tested it twice. And the question was, well, if you're looking at reliability, why are you not looking at the controls? It has been reported in control children, and it's found to be reliable. You see it. The children who show mismatch negativity on day 1, they show it on day 2. But we thought it was equally important to look at the clinical population to see, if you get it once, do you get the same response the next time? So if I have no mismatch negativity the first time, there's no reason why I should see it the second time. Or if I see it in my listening disorder kids the first time, I should see it the next time. That's what I wanted to see. Okay, so this study was basically looking at that. And remember, I said there's a mismatch negativity, which is around 200, 220 millisecond. And then you have a late response, which is late discrimination negativity, which is around 400 milliseconds. And what we found was that visit 2, like I had found earlier, visits 2 seems to be that it becomes, at a group level, it becomes smaller. Which is again, it's almost like if you hear the same thing again and again, it's like a passive learning result. But this needs to be explored further. So I'm not really going to worry too much about it, but I am going to talk about mismatch negativity and its reliability. So this is showing by all of those 85 kids, visit 1 and visit 2, to FZ and CZ, so to front and back. And you can see quite consistently, basically, they are, the LDN is definitely become smaller in my visit 2, but mismatch negativity seems to be more reliable. And if you're wondering what that shaded light color is around, so the dark line shows the mean, and 1 standard deviation is by that lighter colors for the 2 visits. In terms of reliability, look at the numbers. Now, this is showing in clusters because we thought, okay, so we've got 85 kids, right? But they're all listening disorder, but they're so different. So we did a cluster analysis and segregating them in terms of their profiles. Now, I'm not going to go too much into the details of these clusters because that was not the point. All I wanted to say was cluster 1, out of the 85 kids, 34 had a very similar profile. 19 in my second cluster group was similarly profiled, 14 and 18, right? So their performance on their listening, reading, language, attention, memory, very similar. So if that's the case, if you look at mismatch negativity, 62% of them in first measure showed mismatch negativity, and 65% showed on second. But were they the same kids? No. Only 32% of the children with listening problems in the same cluster, so same profile, showed similar mismatch negativity. 32% in cluster 2, 71 of cluster 3. So something weird about or great about cluster 3, and 44% of my cluster 4. So it's not very reliable, is it? For my clinical population, if I test them on day 1, I would say, oh, poor discrimination. On case in visit 2, it could be great discrimination. That's not useful clinically. And I'm going to ignore LDN. But ACC was more reassuring. So here's I think this is my last study. So what this is showing here is the acoustic change complex. This is a recent paper published. Teresa Ching was the first author. And what we did was we looked at ACC to 3 different stimuli, right? So it was ooh, so ooh, and then we also used spectral ripple noise. And the reason we use spectral ripple noise is because, one, the more number of ripples the stimuli has, it represents more like being in a noisy environment. And the other advantage of looking at SRN is if you turn it, if you invert it, literally, you can actually control the loudness, which is hard to do if you take natural ooh. They have different frequency, formants, therefore loudness percept would be slightly different. So you kind of have to wonder, am I getting an ACC to different sounds or to their loudness, right? So I'm going to show you. So this is you can see your ooh, ooh, right? So there is an onset response, the first ACC, the change from ooh to E, then E to ooh, and then ooh to silence, basically. And the same goes with, I know it sounds old, but anyway, you know what I mean. And this has got 115 infants, 43 normal hearing, 72 with hearing impairment, and we tested them twice. First, 3 to 12 months of age and 7 to 12. And the reason why we did that is because we wanted to look at auditory discrimination and its relationship to subsequent language development. This is showing, irrespective of degree of hearing loss, you've got everybody, all normal subjects, all hearing impaired subjects. And basically, we also have your standard deviation. And this is for the 2 stimuli, the ooh, and for 3 to 6 months and the blue shows 7 to 12 months. So they're quite similar. The change is not that dramatic. And what we also noticed was that the ACC was very similar between our normal hearing infants and our 7 to and the infants with mild to moderate losses, but severe to profound losses, no surprise, were significantly poorer. And this here is showing not only the number of subjects, it also shows the response rate, because we looked at the presence of the response, right? Looking at the correlation, intra-class correlations. And for the 3 stimuli, you can see when it is, the last column is to SRN, the least, I guess, speech-like stimuli. So we had children were more noisy in that. They were not very happy with that. But severe to profound, you can see the differences, right? Normal hearing, mild, moderate, the responses are very similar. And this is basically showing, this is again important, the group, this is not at group level, this is at individual level. So interval 1, 3 to 12 months, and 3 to 6 and 7 to 12 months. When they were present the first time, 27 out of 37 were present the second time. So ACC, highly responsible. When they were absent, 3 of them were, 5 of them were absent the first time and 5 were absent the second time. Unfortunately, there were 10 responses that were present the first time, but absent the second time. So there is a little bit of variability there. And when we looked at the rate of the onset and ACC, Basically, what this is showing is the presence of the response in the first interval, the second interval, the difference between the two, and the P level. So how significant is that? And the only significance one you can see for normal hearing between the two times that we measured were for SIR. Not entirely sure. But for the children with hearing loss, they were very similar for the two intervals. And the final question, is your discrimination related to your speech speech development? And we use the PEACH questionnaire, which is the parent response to how your child is doing to different environments, etc. And basically, we found that there was significant correlation. It's not great. It ranges for different scenarios, 0.44 to and the lowest was 0.37. But there's not surprise. We're not saying that discrimination will explain everything about your language development. Of course not. There's so much more to language development, but it is still reassuring that that relationship is there. So that brings me to the last thing, and I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to quickly talk about the last thing. Remember, we do cortical responses, that takes care of hearing. School-age children, you do listening, syllables in noise and get them to respond. That's your listening, that's fine. You do your ACC, again, it's a passive response. We're tackling the hearing and listening. Maybe if you wanted to do sentences, you got people to respond to it, you can do comprehension. But are we doing that? So this is what's exciting to be looking at now as the next step. If you look at the EEG responses at different levels of your auditory pathway, it is really very exciting. This is just to show you the sentences wood is best for making toys and blocks. You can see using EEG as a continuous response at brainstem, right? Auditory nerve, cochlear nucleus, inferior curricula, all of them respond to different aspects of your speech stimuli. But this last one here, this is basically showing you the spectrum of your wood is best for making toys and blocks. And you can see the red line is showing the envelope of the sentence, and different parts of that envelope get encoded at different level. What's exciting is that at cortical level, we are encoding that speech spectrum quite closely to the speech envelope. And what we are doing now is we're trying to look at that, okay? There are people who have published, it's all there. I have to agree, I'm slow, but Verghese and we've been doing that in last couple of years. And I'm encouraging him to speak to you guys, even though it's in speech arena, but talk to you about this very exciting work. But the question is, why should we even bother? Why not stick to that core CVs? They are simple. They make sense. Why bother? Now, this is important. This is work that's done by Jörg Burkhardt, who's my colleague at Macquarie University, an acoustic engineer. He's done a lot of work in realistic speech, realistic measures, right? This here, the graph that I'm sharing with you, shows realistic sentences and realistic noise. So the y-axis shows speech intelligibility, and the x-axis is basically the three scenarios. So the red is realistic sentences and realistic noise, and the blue is clinical sentences and babble noise. Look at the performance difference in the three scenarios. Is it any wonder, right, that people come to our clinics, we do these clinical sentences in babble noise and say, oh yeah, but you're doing well with these devices, and they go away and come back, no, I have problems listening in noise. You hear it all the time. And it's because we're not using the rich noise distractions that are in our real environment. We're not using realistic sentences that tend to be simpler, that tend to have more context, but they're more meaningful. We're not using any of that. So the next stage that we really need to venture into is this. We are so far away from it, at least from clinical perspective. But the least we can do is, even if we don't use the cortical responses, behaviorally, we can start to look at this. That's what I would encourage anybody who's interested in it to be looking at this. So future directions, I think use of naturalistic stimuli, it really is important. It engages the participant. It makes what you do in your labs more meaningful. I mean, from my perspective, that's what they are interested in, looking at the neural responses during conversations and to figure out, do they explain, or can we use that to see a person's speech understanding? Now, I did have a few slides if you were interested in looking at how did we do the cortical responses, the methods, but we're running out of time, so I'm actually going to not speak to that. I'm going to open it up to questions. So, yeah, I might stop sharing. Questions?
Yeah, thank you, Mridula. That was a nice overview of information which you had given. Especially what attracted is trying to correlate our evaluations, what you're doing, with the concept of hearing, listening, comprehension, and communication. I think that's a very relevant that we should relate those things, relate our evaluations to what's happening with the outcomes of it. And you really highlighted how those these evaluations at brainstem level, at cortical level, how we are trying to differentiate them. What really even more attracted me was your last study, where you're trying to say that the naturalistic speech has more meaningful in evaluation rather than unrealistic thing. And that's what we have been doing all along, where we have a standardized test, standardized test conditions. The patient does well in the clinic and we say, bye-bye, you're doing good. But when he goes to the realistic situations, he has some issues.
Yeah.
But here, now what I think, I'm sure the audience also would be having a lot of thought, but I just wanted to know, when this comes, like when you want to evaluate a person with a natural stimuli or their contextual, their linguistic kind of a thing, how do we have to control the other variables, where we talk about standardization and everything? Is that going to influence, or how do we balance that?
So, I mean, I guess this is, at least in behavior studies, what's happening is, and Jörg's doing a lot of work with this, they are using, they went to different scenarios and actually recorded realistic sounds. They went to the train station, they went to the food court and, the malls, etc. And so they're using that as the background noise. And conversations. Like recently what I did was I recorded children speaking to each other, teenagers having a conversation, friends, and I've recorded that, and I'm looking at their the EEG to that. And the reason why we need to your question about how do we standardize it, that's not hard, because all you need, what I'm saying is bring the real life into your lab, because you're right, standardization is important. We can't just say, okay, I'm going to have live voice conversation with you. If you really like that person, you might be slower in your intonation. So live voice, we know, does not work. That's a bad idea. We're not going back there. That's what we did, 50 years ago. We're not going there. All I'm saying is it's time to use what's real into our clinical practice. And that's really, and I think the academia can take initiative in this, in creating like students project. Let them go into different scenarios to record different scenes and have that ready, have that available.
Yeah, that's a good thought and a point for all the professionals who are working in the academic area to start collecting this kind of a stimuli which can be used for evaluation.
Yeah, there are a couple of questions here. Do you mind if I take those?
Yeah, please, you have to. Thank you.
So Anup, you asked if a larger responses, amplitudes, they mean better perception. I'm not going to say, I think maybe, but we're not sure. We are more clear in saying that when it is absent, then definitely the percept is not there. Yeah. But when it's there, that ability to quantify, we haven't looked at that. So I don't know. But that's the next thing, I guess, that needs to be done. But we definitely are clearer when it's absent versus when it's present. Is there a correlation between, Sunny Karana, you asked, between LLRs or cortical responses with tone burst stimuli and speech perception? I'm not sure what you mean. If you're asking, do you get the same sort of, actually, no, I'm not sure. Sunny, would you like to speak up and ask me what you wanted to know?
Good afternoon, ma'am. Actually, I wanted to know whether how we correlate with the speech stimuli and we get cortical responses and we comment on the speech perception. Can same be extrapolated with respect to the tone burst stimuli if we use it instead of speech stimuli?
I mean, you're right. We're using CVs to make comment about speech perception. But may I just clarify that even when you use the tokens, that's all we are doing, right?
Yes,
when I use murder, whatever, all of these are at syllable level, right? They're complex, so they're not at the peak is not at exactly one precise frequency. They are more complex, but nevertheless, all we are saying is that we know that this person can perceive it. So sure, you want to use tone burst, but all you'll say is you heard that tonal, you heard that tone.
Okay.
So I think you would speak to that as a tonal percept, but I don't think, because tones tend to be, in fact, because they're longer duration, they definitely are more frequency specific than they are with ABR, but they're still tonal. That's still tonal percept. I don't think you would talk about it as speech percept, but you could still identify, sure, the person can hear at that frequency, the baby can hear at that frequency. So yeah.
Because ma'am, so sorry, in my clinical practice, when I encounter about ANHD cases, we do this ABR with click stimuli and tone burst stimuli. When it is absent, we find cochlear microphonics. So to comment on prognosis with hearing aid or CI, we look for LLR. So that time we do use tone burst stimuli only.
See, I would recommend that you use the speech stimuli, because it's just, I mean, there's nothing wrong. You can use your tonal CIEPs, but I guess my question to you would be, why are you using the tonal stimuli? Are you trying to create a PTA with that?
Not PTA, ma'am, just to see whether there is some activity occurring at the cortical level or not. And
Yeah.
based on that to comment whether hearing aid will give any progress or not.
Yeah. Yeah, so you're basically doing
Counsel
what
the
Gary
patient.
Rance, this is classic Gary Rance's work. Fantastic that you're doing that in your clinic. That's really good.
Thanks.
I mean, if you can't use or integrate your speech stimuli and you've got tonal stimuli, sure, you could make it more complex. You could use chords, etc., just so you can get the idea. I guess the advantage of using a complex stimulus is that you can comment across number of frequencies rather than one particular frequency. So if you did, if you're able to use a da or a da, that just also has a face validity for your clients.
Okay, ma'am.
So are you able to add a waveform?
Till now I've not tried that. I have to look into it. I think we can add custom streamline that.
Which unit are you using? Is it interacoustics?
Yes, ma'am. No,
Yeah,
not
you
acoustics, ma'am. It was IHS.
Oh yeah, definitely. IHS can take that in, no problem.
Yes, ma'am.
So I think it has a duration limitation. So you just need to make sure. So yeah. So use your Mata gas and yeah.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Any other questions? Thank you, Madhuri.
Ma'am, you had mentioned you had used the native Australian speaker voice for the stimuli. Did you happen to study what would be the difference if the natural speaker is used and what do you call it, simulated or a synthetic stimuli is used?
No, I have not. We always assume that if we used more natural stimuli, we should get a more robust cortical response. I haven't done that, but I noticed there was a recent paper that's come out where they from UK where they've done cortical responses. This is under again my colleague and mentor Suzanne Purdy, and what they did was they have used these simulated stimuli and recorded. I think in that paper had 1,000 babies, because what they did was, it's very exciting. They had a bus, they took their Hear Lab and they went everywhere, wherever the babies were, to record in their homes. And I think they got good responses. So I guess so long as they are complex, I just I'm not gonna say one is better or the other, but we've always, whenever we have tried to use speech stimuli, if you're using speech stimuli, might as well make it the natural stimuli. But the duration does matter. The fact that we use very short stimuli, if you make it 40 milliseconds or even 79 milliseconds, there's nothing natural anymore about it. So there's no reason why you can't use synthetic stimuli. But if you're using a longer stimuli, like 150 milliseconds, where it's the voice is clear, you can perceive that sound for what it is, then I would say use natural tokens.
Ma'am, you mentioned that it's better to use realistic sentences or realistic words when they're using for AEPs. But I mean, as you said, the duration is an important feature. If you increase the duration, your peaks keep shifting to the higher latency values, and also there is superimposition of the preceding and succeeding vowel imposed on the ACC or the MNN. So how do we face this challenge, or how do we solve this?
So if you're looking at the word level or sentence level, then of course the measurement is completely different. If you're trying to do when we've used sentences, and I think Vijay Nane is also there. He's looked at some of that work that I've done. When we used something like a spin a test where, predictable versus highly unpredictable, and we put the trigger on the word level where the word was unpredictable, you are then starting to look at P600 or N400, depending on how you change or what the prediction is going to be, the kind of sentences you use, be it a synthetic versus semantic difference. So you're right. The type of stimulus, the duration of stimulus will change your analysis. It will change what you're looking at. And it's certainly not going to be that simple P1, N1, P2 anymore. Those make sense with the syllables. And I think we are so comfortable using that's what we were, because they're so robust, we see them, we use them. But the moment you're trying to look at sentence level, conversation level, that's inherent. There is going to be, the co-articulation is there. There's variation in amplitude. So you start to see your brainstem response and cortical responses. So you do completely different analysis, which I didn't really speak about today, sorry.
So I think if the duration of the stimulus is increased, like a word or a sentence, rather than the measurement of amplitude or latency, such critical measurements, we can only see the ACC present or absent. Will that help in understanding the child's discrimination ability?
So ACC would be to, it looks at the change. So every time you have, so for instance, if I said the word, I don't know, let's say pencil, right? The moment you say the initial P, there's going to be a response, right? The onset response. The change from P to N to S to L, every time you will have an ACC. It'll become too messy for you to see. So if you really just want to see an ACC, my suggestion would be take shorter tokens. Okay, keep them simple, like we did with ooey ooh, right? Keep them, the duration is important. That paper is published, so please have a look at, because the problem you raised about preceding and succeeding stimuli, that's an important feature. That's an important factor. But if you want to assess at sentence level, if the person is hearing the context and can predict the next word, then you're looking at a completely different stimulus. Then it's not, ACC is a small component of the components you're going to be measuring. Yeah. So it's a different paradigm. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So there was one study, I just thought I should mention that. There was one study where they did the N400 and P600 evaluation with congruent and non-congruent sentences to see if there is an ACC or not, first thing, and to see if there are any changes in the latency values of the N400. But the challenge again was, one, they used the Kannada stimuli. Kannada stimuli again will not have so many combinations of initial consonant. We don't have a stimulus which has less vowels, more consonants. Because vowels, again, it's easier when you see the AEP, vowel effects are much conspicuous and it is very clear. But when there's a change in the consonant in the two stimuli, that becomes very challenging to observe and to note down also.
Because that'll elicit, that'll give you a change complex. So I wouldn't have, if you're looking at ACC, I wouldn't look at sentence level. I would really look at word level. And if you are looking at word level, then look at the gaps then. So sticking to the N400, P600 at sentence level, perfectly is sensible. That makes sense.
Yeah.
But happy to look at those responses if you've got them, if you need another pair of eyes to have a look at them.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Sure. Ma'am, if you are using words as a stimuli, what would you say? Can we use natural stimuli? That is, we record natural stimuli, but can we get them to 300 to 350 milliseconds? Can you see the ACC then?
See, it'll get messy. The moment you have a word, it goes back to that same point. The moment there is a word, every change from syllable to syllable within the word will elicit a response, and they will all overlap. So if you're doing at word level, I would stick to the N400, P600 kind of paradigm.
And if we use CVC context, and
Yes.
only the one of the consonant, either the initial or the final consonant varying, and
Yeah.
use some words for that, then will it be clearer? Can we
Give me an example. What are you thinking?
something like here and here? Hell, I'm not getting the
Yeah.
word, but something like only the final consonant is changing.
Here. Well, there's no gap, so that should, I guess, look at it spectrally. Because
Yeah.
that's the thing. If you look at it spectrally, you see the change spectrally, you know you will get an ACC there.
So something like a minimal pair where only the final consonant or there's a difference, then
Yeah.
maybe we'll be able to get something.
Yeah.
Shorter stimuli.
Yeah. Do it spectrally. Cortical, that's the best part about the corticals, that your percept is represented in your cortical response.
Okay. Imran, anything? Anybody? Krishna sir?
Nothing from my end. Any audience questions from the audience?
What do you think, Mridula, about the scope of Here Lab? Do you think, I mean, you
Here
are
Lab is-
probably in the hub of it, so you'd know better than any of us. What do you think?
Here Lab at the moment is I think it's I think the fact that people are using other equipment is a good thing. So use interacoustics, use IHS.
And ma'am, are there any studies which, like you have compared CVC kind of a context, and any studies comparing aided and unaided? Something like
Yeah, so the last study that I was talking about, that was that was more aided. It wasn't comparing aided to, but there are lots of papers now. I didn't speak too much about it because it's so well published now, aided versus unaided. If your gain is appropriate, you will see a cortical response.
And how does that help clinically? If I say there is a cortical response with the hearing aid user, he has a response, how will that help me in my clinical?
What a good question. Because again, if you're just looking at cortical response to ba ma, ma ta ga, then all you're saying is that they hear it with the aided response. So the aided response is there. But if you really want to make sense of what's their discrimination ability, what's their take on it, then actually you have to do something like an ACC, so that you can be reassured that if the child is able to discriminate, shows an ACC, and our infants, 2-3 month olds can show you an ACC, then that clinically makes more sense, because then you can say that this child should have appropriate or has auditory discrimination ability, and therefore will have has better chance of acquiring language. You can only say that much, because like I said, the correlations are 0.4, that which means that there are other important factors that must also be considered.
So like we are using aided LLR as of now, to get an understanding of how the child's perception is with the hearing aid or with the cochlear implant. Do you think in future this would move to looking at the ACC or MNN?
Yeah, I think the future is now. Now is when we should be doing it. And with cochlear implant, because you get the artifact, ACC even at the vowel level is perfect, because you will get that artifact at the beginning, but then you can have a continuous stimuli changing, right? From ow, e, or whatever. You can take your link sounds and do it.
Okay. Dr. Vijay is also here. If he can put in a word or about his work also. I think he's also worked in this area. Krishna sir, he's there, sir?
I'm not sure. I see his name Vijay Kumar. Is he Vijay Kumar Narne or
No, I think that's
he has to
another Vijay.
respond?
Okay. Anybody else would like to say anything about their work or anything related to the area? Please contribute. I don't think anybody is opening up. Imran, anything?
No, ma'am. I think we've addressed all questions.
Okay.
Just one on a closing remark. Can you, Professor Mridula, can you
Yeah.
just give some tips for the clinicians, how this knowledge of this clinical one, how we have noticed these variations, can they apply in their clinical practice? Because, doing this acoustic change complex or observing MMN, all this in a clinical practice is a challenge, both in terms of equipment and the time. But how do we impart this knowledge over there? Both in maybe in a hearing aid practice, or it may be in diagnosis, or it may be in CI.
I think like earlier we were talking, Sunny was talking about his work. That's pretty much perfect, that you with infants, because adults you can talk to them, right? School-age children, if they are not very communicative, you do your ACC. I would say stick to ACC. ACC is reliable. It's present more in times. Like we had 87% of the time it was consistently present in first time and second time, and that's what you want, right? It's easy to do that and use the if you can't do that, use cortical responses to Martaka or tonal stimuli, like Sunny was talking about. Do that with those who can't communicate, to make sure that you're able to effectively fit the device. If they can't tell you, you need a mechanism, and cortical responses are robust. They tell you that. And you can, if you can use 2 channels, most of the equipment, you can do 2 ipsilateral and contralateral. So instead of doing like in an ABR, ipsilateral, contralateral, do CZ or a CZ, FZ, right? As the 2 channels. So then you have 2 channels to compare.
Yeah, that's it. I think, Srividya.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. That's it.
Okay. So shall we conclude? I
So
think
we have one question now. Of late,
Yeah, so there's talking about how do we use cortical responses in analyzing auditory processing. See, auditory processing is everything. I think if you can use cortical responses for auditory discrimination, then that's right. So using ACC which is what I was showing with my reading disorder, listening in noise. You can do words in noise, syllable in noise. All of that would work.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so with that, I think all the questions in the audience also are addressed. And I think that's a good message that we should take up as Professor Mridula is saying. Yes, cortical responses are definitely useful for us in understanding the auditory processing that is happening, and that will help in terms of outcomes also, the clinical outcomes, the benefit from the hearing aid or a cochlear implant, or even in any conditions that we are looking at it. So with that information which she has given, I thank Professor Mridula for her sharing of information with us on this forum today. Thank you, Professor Mridula, and I'm sure all of you can be in touch with her for any further clarifications on these things. Thank you.
Cheers. Good night. Thank you very much.
Maybe Dr. Mridula can put her email ID here. There are a few requests for her email ID for contact.